So this is going to mark the return of my benchmarking videos for my channel. And while I was gone, I saw a lot of comments on my past videos about doing Grand Theft Auto 5, Black Ops 3, and some other video games that I may own now and may not, but I do have Grand Theft Auto 5, so I saw so many of that I wanted to start with that game. And if you're familiar with any of my benchmarking videos, this is going to be a little bit different than how I used to organize my tests. If you've seen any in the past, I would normally go through all the different default graphical settings that the game had to offer at different resolutions and then show on average how many frames per second you'd be getting at each of those settings for resolution and graphical settings. For these future tests and this current one, I'm going to be doing something a little different, like I said. I'm still looking at main graphical defaults and I'm checking out frames per second, and I'm also going to be looking at the different resolutions that may be offered in the game or that laptop is optimized for, but I'm also going to be looking at the average temperature of the components inside the laptop while running these tests. This is still the same Razer Blade 14, which is the 2014 edition that I was using for all of my previous videos, and it's running the NVIDIA 870M chipset for its GPU. If you haven't checked out any of my past benchmarks, hit the annotation on the right. I'll put it up there for you. There's a playlist on my channel if you're interested. I do other games like Fallout 4, Star Wars Battlefront, Battlefield 4, games like that. So let's just get started. For Grand Theft Auto 5, I looked at running the game at 1920 by 1080, as well as laptop's native resolution 3200 by 1800p. I ran the game's built-in benchmarking test for the data as well, because since it has one that it's made for, it's probably the best thing to use for these type of tests. First off, running the game on normal graphical settings at 1080p resolution. The game overall runs really great. I was surprised how good it was still looking as well, even though it was just normal graphical settings. The game reached to probably about a max of 120 frames per second and only dipped to around 60 frames per second, so that's the perfect mark. You can also see that the temperatures on these charts that I made for the CPU under max load during the benchmark averaged around low 80s to mid 90s, while the GPU only reached as high as about 90 degrees Celsius. So, and that sharp drop off at the end on all these charts just shows the benchmark ending and the computer coming back to a normal resting temperature. So next, I tested the same 1080p resolution under high graphical settings. There was a slight dip in performance, but that's pretty much to be expected because you're running the game at a higher graphical setting. It still performed very smoothly under all the tests, reaching as high as around low 80s in FPS and only dipping again to about the 60 FPS mark. Still a very good result, as well as the internal temperature stayed roughly the same as running when the tests we did at normal graphics settings. The CPU cores reached high 80s to mid 90s under load, and the GPU held steady around 90 degrees. It reached a little bit higher than the last test, but it was under further load because we're using and we're rendering higher graphical settings. The last 1080p test I ran was running the game at very high settings, set to all the same settings as what it was before and high, but now just very high. The game maxed around 60 FPS and then dropped to about 40 range. So it's average though in the 50s. So this was by far the largest drop that we'd seen since those first two tests. This is still an acceptable FPS range if high graphical settings are really important to you. And as well, the temperature is held steady on the same benchmark test load. CPU cores didn't waver much, as high as mid 90s, while the GPU held pretty steady about 90-91 degrees Celsius. And then my next few tests that I ran for the laptop was focused on the 1800p resolution, like I said previously. So running the game on normal graphical settings was pretty comparable to running it at very high settings at 1080p. There was a large dip in the max resolution, hitting around 60 frames per second and dipping as low as 30 frames. The temperature stayed roughly the same as the first three tests, which is starting to make me wonder and think that the hardware itself is probably throttling itself so that it doesn't go over a max temperature set by the chipset and by the manufacturer. If this is the case, it's a really good thing because you don't want to wear out your hardware. Moving on to high graphical settings, there was even a further performance drop. The game reached around a max of 40 FPS while falling to around the mid-20s. This is the point where the game is technically still playable, but I'm not sure why you would want to when there are other options available to you at a lower resolution. There's also, you can see a short spike in the CPU core 2, climbing to, for just a second, as high as around 96 degrees Celsius. I think for the Razer Blade, if any single component gets to 100 degrees, the graphics driver fails to save the hardware and closes all applications. So it was getting close on this test. And the GPU temperature stayed still around 90 to 91 degrees. The last test ran for Grand Theft Auto 5 was 1800p resolution at very high graphical settings. And at this point, the game's unplayable, and it's really not that much of a surprise either. The max frames per second during the benchmark reached about 27 FPS and dropped to as low as 18. Looking at the temperature chart for the setting, I think this can pretty much confirm that there must be a throttle in the chipset. This is about the coolest we've seen each component run on any tested settings, and was by far the worst actual result. This is a really good thing to know too, because if you're considering buying this laptop for gaming, these settings on the chipset could actually help save hardware from overheating and ruining and breaking. So I'm sure these same throttles are set amongst the newer Razer Blade models as well. And so to sum up each test, you can see that at lower resolutions and lower graphical settings, you're obviously going to be getting higher frames per second. But this FPS chart that I made hopefully shows you that there's still options for this laptop to play the game pretty effectively while not having to sacrifice graphics completely. You can also see in this degradation chart that I made, this is a pretty steady decline in FPS throughout each test, and showing the comparison between high settings at 1080p and normal settings at 1800p. Overall, the laptop ran really well against Grand Theft Auto 5, especially considering the new 14s will be running desktop-grade NVIDIA 1060s, and this chipset on both the CPU and the GPU will be almost 3 years old at this point, so I'm really impressed. And based on my findings, I personally will be running this game probably at the 1080p resolution with high graphical settings. With this, you'll average around any time above 60 frames per second, and you're not going to be gaining any temperature savings by playing on normal settings. But I hope you found this video helpful, guys. Please leave a suggestion in the comments for any other games you'd like me to do similar tests on. I know some others wanted to do, like I said, Black Ops 3 multiplayer was one. I still need to pick that game up. But some of the ones that I wanted to do was Overwatch, No Man's Sky, and probably Doom, because those are the games that I'm playing pretty frequently on my PC right now. So keep an eye out for those if you're interested. And thanks for taking the time. Subscribe for more, like I said. And as always, I hope your day is beer and Skittles.